to my next video. Thank you for joining me. Today we'll be discussing climate change and the Tower of Babel and what the two actually have in common. So I just want to set it out at the very beginning that I did intend on keeping this channel purely religious and not getting political. But of course, climate change along with COVID, of course, they're part of the same agenda. They're coming out of my ears. They're all over the news. And so I wanted to look at what the Bible says and what the Jewish commentaries say. And you will discover that what the generation of the climate change religion and the generation of the builders of the Tower of Babel have in common is their purpose to interfere with the natural weather pattern. So let us start by looking at what the Bible says, what the biblical narrative is of the Tower of Babel. So we're told that the whole world had one language and a common speech. That, of course, is the Hebrew language. And they said to each other, "Come, let us build a city for ourselves with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it's called Babel, confusion, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Wow. So we see that they wanted to build this tower, and not just a tower, but a city as well, to make themselves equal to God and to make it possible for them to stay together as a community. And there are many different viewpoints from our sages to explain the deeper reason why they wanted to do this, but there is a consensus that they thought that God would send another flood to the earth, and they wanted to avoid that. So remember, this is the first generation after the Great Flood, and so they grew up with stories about the Great Flood, and they didn't want God to send another flood. How could this be achieved? The Talmud tells us that they intended to pierce the sky to drain all the water held in the clouds, and thereby making it impossible for God to bring about another flood, as if God could run out of water, of course. Another opinion says that they were actually split into three groups. One wanted to be on high, as in above the waters, so that when the flood would come, they would stay on top. Another group wanted to use it as a shrine for idol worship. And the third group wanted to place themselves on a platform from which they would actually battle God. Now, the Midrash story says that they said to themselves, "One time for every 1,656 years, the firmament totters. So rather let us go and let us make pillars, one from the north, one from the south, and one from the west. And this will serve as a support from the east." Now, the flood happened in the year 1,656 from creation. So they imagined that the heavens would collapse every 1,656 years. So they wanted to erect this scaffolding in order to support the heavens. The Maharal says that they wanted to blur the distinction between God's realm and theirs, so they wouldn't feel so powerless about their fate. They understood the earthly conditions, and indeed, they understood that these weather events were determined by metaphysical rules in the sky, and by reaching into the sky, mankind would get a handle on the forces of the so-called upper world and lessen its influence on his fate. Man would actually ascend into this upper world in a sense of becoming part of the upper world. So in conclusion, their purpose was to change the weather pattern. And this very much reminds us of the geoengineering that is happening today, in which they intervene in the climate system, they manipulate the weather with electromagnetic fields, they clamp clouds together to make it rain, they use this solar radiation modification to actually deter the rays of the sun from the earth. They remove carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere, etc., you name it. Now, Rabbi Berlin is not from Berlin. He's actually from 19th century Poland, but his last name is Berlin. So Rabbi Berlin from the 19th century Poland is of the view that the builders of the Tower of Babel were the first social engineers hoping to create a utopian society where all lived and thought as one. And I looked up his biography, and it doesn't mention it, but I see that his lifespan almost entirely overlaps that of Karl Marx's. Now, whether he was familiar with Marx's communist thesis or not, I can imagine that the societal and industrial changes of the 19th century had a great influence on him, and he sounds like he was in the know about world happenings. And he talks about a utopian society, and this is exactly what the New World Order agenda wants right now, a robotic groupthink without dissent. And Rabbi Berlin sets out that the builders of the tower feared that if they would be scattered, it would mean that they would develop separate cultures and thus distinct ways of thinking. They wanted everyone to live in a controlled environment to remain culturally homogeneous. The tower served as a base to plant a circular colony around so that nobody would leave their immediate environment. Sounds familiar? There's nothing new under the sun. Lockdowns, control of movement. And he says that the Tower of Babel was the first step towards a tyrannical state where no individual expression would be tolerated, so God had to split them into separate nations. It's pretty strong, isn't it? Now, the basis of the climate change religion, of course, as the basis of all false religions, is the worship of creation over the Creator. The Midrash warns us about it, the Lubavitcher Rebbe warns us about it, and actually the analogy that the Midrash uses is that there is a king who enters a country with his dukes, prefects, and commanders. And one person says, I will choose the duke as my patron, and the other person says, I will choose the commander as my patron. But the clever person says, I will choose the king because all the others are subject to replacement. And the king, of course, is God. So there's a parallel to say that the nations serve the sun and the moon, while Israel serves the Holy One, blessed be He. And those who worship the stars and the constellations, which of course in today's world could mean the worship or the veneration of nature itself, they think that these intermediaries are completely independent of God. And because of this illusion, thinking that God abandoned the earth, they serve nature so as to motivate nature to give them or to grant them greater prosperity. So you often hear it said, if we're gracious to nature, nature will be gracious to us. Now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe sets out a more profound underlying motive for their misdirected veneration, namely that they do not desire to nullify themselves. In other words, they don't want to practice any selflessness. They adore their false deities, the false deity of nature, for example, because if they worship the one and true God, they would need to rise above themselves and dedicate their lives to a higher purpose, family, for example. And most importantly, they would have to submit to God. But we know that this is an arrogant and rebellious generation that does not want to submit to God. Now, what happened to the tower builders and what is likely to happen to this generation as well, unfortunately? They built the tower so that they wouldn't be scattered. And the very same thing ended up happening to them. They said to themselves, let's build this tower lest we be scattered. And actually this was fulfilled in what's prophesied in Proverbs, which says, the fear of the wicked, it shall come upon him. In other words, if you commit some kind of wickedness in order to avoid something, it will happen to you. And Hasidic philosophy teaches us that they wanted to draw down God's blessings without following God's will. Exactly the same as today. Now, interestingly, the Mishnah, the oral Torah, draws a comparison between the generation of the Tower of Babel and the generation of the flood. So the generation of the Tower of Babel is also referred to as the generation that was dispersed. So interestingly, we can see a lot of parallels with what's happening today. The sins of the generation of Noah were very apparent before the flood because there was all kinds of violence, there was murder, there was immorality. While the sin of the tower builders was very clandestine because it isn't explicitly stated in the Bible that there was something wrong with building a tower or that this tower itself was undesirable. So we see the very same insidious behavior today from these elites. Because they're not evidently killing us by guns, nevertheless, they are waging a war on our health, on our freedom, on our livelihood, and most of all, of course, on our minds. And I know that a lot of people feel uncomfortable with comparisons with the Nazis. Nevertheless, we need to look at the underlying intentions and purposes and the very same end goal that they have, even though the means are very different. So they don't actually shoot us dead, but they force us to put poison into our bodies. They restrict our freedom of movement. They restrict our freedom of speech. They thrust us into bankruptcy. People go bankrupt and poor, and they try to brainwash us with this non-stop propaganda. Now, what will their punishment be? We are told by our sages that the generation of the tower will not be granted a place in the world to come. And obviously there's a question as to why, because their sins were seemingly a lot less severe than the sins of the generation of the flood, for example. And so the explanation is that in the generation of the flood, people sinned against each other. So they took other people's lives, they robbed them, and they were very, very evil in a very revealed way. On the other hand, the generation of the tower sinned against God himself. The former, that is the generation of the flood, already received their punishment in this world because they were wiped out by the waters. The latter will receive their retribution in the next world because they actually sought to fight against God. And so that's why their sin is centered on the relationship between man and God. The first one was physically punished, while the second one will be spiritually punished. And we know, unfortunately, that spiritual punishment is much more severe. So the lessons for us are obvious to learn. In closing, I just want to quote a famous verse from Psalm 127, which says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain." So anything we strive to accomplish without God will be a waste. It will be wasted. And anything we strive to accomplish against God will end up destroying us. I hope it won't happen to any of us. Thank you for listening and hope to see you on my next video. Bye-bye.